nervous. So I'm Harry. I'm from Adelaide, originally from Darwin. I've been coaching parkour for about 8 years now, and I've done it in a few different places. But I've also I now have a degree in human movement from the University of South Australia. So I've kind of used that to inform my practice, and we're going to try and unify parkour and some of the concepts that are more applicable broad, or like have kind of been picked and chosen from other disciplines and sports. So commercial sport, as anybody who's done parkour probably has already figured out, like commercial sport sometimes gets some things wrong, but it also gets a lot of stuff right, and we're going to try and look at that today. So things that this lecture will not do: this will not be an in-depth interrogation of which exercises are good, or which rep ranges are good, or anything like that. This is a more foundational look at how to kind of prescribe, or how to like guide people's training effectively, how to make informed decisions about what you should be doing, or what perhaps you could be doing differently, rather than anything super specific about any specific exercise. Like I'm not going to be saying like do push-ups, they're the greatest thing ever, or anything like that. So Kel, can I grab the next slide? Is that okay? Yeah, cool. So the learning objectives today. After this lecture, you should be able to understand the purpose and the methodology of prescribing exercise, distinguish between what we mean by conditioning and just working out. You should have a foundational understanding of physiological concepts, really bare bones basic stuff, nothing too crazy. So don't freak out about having to learn lots of new words, but and their relationship to exercise and its prescription, and also knowing the various aspects of fitness and their effect, and also being confident in performing basic exercise prescription. These are the things that we should be able to kind of get from this sesh. So if we go to the next slide, then we will see what is conditioning in this context. So let's define some terms, and some of this stuff you'll already be familiar with, obviously. So we generally, in sports science, we kind of distinguish between practice and training. So there is skill-related practice, which work that targets skill and seeks to improve technical performance. So you practice piano, you get better at piano. You don't necessarily get any stronger at piano. Training, however, is work that targets your physiology, or your body, and seeks to improve some aspect of your physical performance. So if you want to run really far, but you've already got really good running technique, you don't have any, like, your elbows aren't slashing all over the place, and you don't look like you're having a heart attack, but you're still really not able to run, then you would be doing training. The improvement that is gained from training, the gains that you make, is called conditioning. As in, someone is an extremely high level of conditioning. So in parkour, we tend to call everything that we do training, whether or not it's directed or particularly intentional, whether it's just play or not. So sometimes some things that we refer to training might actually be closer to practice, or free-form play. So this is why I'm defining the terms. I'm going to refer to conditioning and the act of training for conditioning as conditioning, just so it's doing legwork for 2 words here today. Okay, so if we look at the next slide, let's talk about how conditioning differs from working out. So working out, I'm going to lump in like doing physical challenges in parkour, like doing a mile of quadrupedal movement or doing 1,000 squats with a nat gap. Those are good things to do, but they're not necessarily the best thing to do. So conditioning is 5 things. It's a fistful of things. Specific, it is like exercises are always chosen carefully for what they give the participant. They are not arbitrary. Exercise is always, conditioning, sorry, is always directed, as in it has a specific purpose in mind, whether that is power generation or strength or endurance or flexibility or cardiovascular fitness or whatever. Exercise is always, or conditioning is always justified, i.e. we're not doing exercises for their own sake, but because they are known or shown to be helpful to what we want to do. So if I want to get bigger jumps, I would train something that we know makes my jumps big. It is minimal, not in terms of how much effort we put in. A lot of conditioning protocols, especially like high intensity interval training, is really, really grueling. It's phenomenally hard. But instead, we are kind of seeking the minimum effective dose to make improvements on our performance. We don't want to be doing conditioning for 17 hours if we're already trying to do most stuff or do parkour stuff, okay? Because the more time we spend on conditioning, the less we have for training. And exercise is supplementary. So conditioning and training for conditioning is the means to an end. It's only ever a way to get something. We are not interested in being the best at exercising. We want to be better at parkour, ideally. And that's why we seek the minimal effective dose. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, let's look at the principles of fitness. That being said, how do we think about fitness for the purposes of getting conditioning? So principles of fitness, this, some of you may have already seen this, or at least one of these things. These are the things, the like laws of fitness that apply to pretty much everybody. So SAID principle, or specific adaptation to imposed demands, okay, progressive overload, the FIT principle, frequency, intensity, time, and type, reversibility, individuality, and variation. So these will all affect how your training is undertaken depending on what you want. Okay, if you're not training toward the thing you want to achieve, you won't get better at the thing you want to. That's the SAID principle. Also, if you are doing lots of conflicting things, if you want to get better at, you want to improve your maximum power output, but you also want to improve your flexibility, but you also want to improve your cardiovascular endurance, but you also want to improve your muscular endurance, then you're going to start to get diminishing returns in each of those, and you might see that your body starts to complain or fall apart a little bit just because there's too many conflicting stimuli that you're trying to adapt to at the same time. So you pick one thing or two things and then you work on that for a bit and get better at it. That will be a way to use this principle to your advantage. Progressive overload, it's kind of two parts of the same coin. So overload refers to like the things you do should be hard enough that you have a training effect, is what we call it, which is hard enough that your body overcompensates for what it has been given in the past. So in order to achieve that, you need it to be decently hard at the very least. You don't, walking to the shops does not make your legs 6 feet wide each. Okay, it needs to be an overload because otherwise you won't adapt to it. If you're already fine with it, then you're fine with it. Progressive overload refers to over time, as we get better and our body kind of compensates progressively for that load, we will get diminishing returns. So we need to keep making it harder. And this is why exercise, no matter who you are or where you are, can kind of suck some of the time because it doesn't necessarily get easier, you just get better at it. Frequency, intensity, time, and type are ways to adjust what you are doing. And generally, if something is higher intensity and you do it for a greater frequency of days during the week, then your time spent doing it will by necessity diminish, and the type of training will have to change. So if you do something very, very intense a lot of the time, you won't be able to do it for very long. If you are doing something for a really long space of time and it's always really quick, then you'll need to make the intensity less. So that's a way to think about pulling your training in different directions based on what you want. Reversibility, anything you gain, you can also lose. So if you take some time off, you may find that you can't do something anymore. You were strong at this thing, then you're no longer strong, because your body will only ever adapt to what you give it. Variation, as you get better at stuff, you need to change what you're doing. Your body will adapt, and it'll adapt very well, but it will adapt better if you give it more variety, because as we know, it is the spice of life. Recovery kind of refers, I've put this in at the end just because it's important. In order to make any gain, in order to make any training effect and have it stick, you need to allocate recovery time. For a lot of elite athletes, like elite gymnasts or long distance runners at the Olympics, or football teams, because they train so much and they train so much skill-based stuff that's also quite physically taxing, their training programs are more about finding places to allocate recovery than they are about getting stronger. You know, it's trying to put in places for them to rest and recover so that they can continue to improve. So recovery is super important, and I've seen people in real life forget about it and be like, nah, if I just do more, I'll get stronger. And it's not always the case. So I've chucked that one in there as well. Acknowledge your need to recover. So prescribing exercise. Which slide? Then prescribing exercise. Just allocating exercises for people to do. When we are prescribing exercise, we need to keep in mind the principles of fitness, the 6 ones we just talked about: SAID, progressive overload, reversibility, fit, recovery, variation, and also, I think I've lost one, individuality. Oh, yeah, individuality. I forgot about that. Individuality just refers to, like, the differences in people will mean that they excel in different things. But when we are prescribing exercise, we do need to keep in mind the principles of fitness, as they will all affect the way in which we train, depending on what we need. And they're pretty intuitive, and they're more or less immutable for the majority of the population. Most people will be beholden to a greater or lesser extent to those principles. We do, however, need to be mindful of things like client goals. So first and most important thing I want you to think about is client goals. We can reasonably assume that as parkour coaches, everybody you're going to be coaching wants to get better at parkour. That's why they would train hard, right? But what better at parkour means for them might be different for every single one of your students. So you're going to have to kind of nut that out and figure out where they want to be and why. So keep in mind client goals. You can't just cookie cutter everything. Okay, second thing, you want your condition to be justified, conditioning to be justified and justifiable. Okay, so what that means is, if you're ever asked why you're doing a specific exercise, you should be able to articulate clearly the reasoning behind your choice of exercise and why you picked what you picked over something else. So ideally, an exercise should be selected because there's robust evidence that it is helpful for the goals you've outlined. But failing that, there should at least be some thought put into the way you've laid out your conditioning session, using some form of functional anatomy and some understanding of physiological principles. Like you don't have to cite academic sources for why squats make your legs stronger. You don't have to go that far, but if you can reason out why squats are likely to make your legs stronger, then good stuff. But it's not enough. It's never simply enough to pick an exercise because it's hard or because it's good for your arms. You know, in an ideal world, you're not just able to articulate that push-ups are good for your arms, but why they're good for your arms, for what purpose, and in what way. Okay, so approaching it a little bit more critically is really good. Also, client-specific circumstances and individualized needs. You're going to need to be cognizant of that. If someone's got an injury, or if someone's pregnant, or if someone is heavier than most of the people you train, or if someone is older or younger or has learning difficulties, all of those things are going to affect how you run conditioning, particularly in a class where, you know, you may find people are at different levels of fitness and training. So you kind of need to be mindful of that sort of thing, of your class participants' needs, individual needs, so that you don't get into that trap where someone says, "Hey, I have my knee is injured, so I can't do squats," and you've just mapped out an entire conditioning session based around legs, and you just go, "Oh crap, okay, guess we won't do that then." So get on top of that before you start thinking about what exercises, and you'll be a lot better off. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, got a really helpful thing for thinking about this sort of thing called a needs analysis, which is originally written by a pair of scientists called Fleck and Kramer. So the needs analysis is a kind of checklist to go through this with. Okay, so you should look at what major muscle groups need to be trained, what type of training, strength, power, or endurance, or whatever, what energy system. We'll talk about that in a sec if you don't know what an energy system is or what I mean by that, and what are the primary sites of concern for injury. Okay, if you do lots of push-ups, where are people going to be at risk? Where are people going to be hurt potentially? Okay, so following that, you can start to think about what exercises will be performed, the order in which they'll be performed, the number of sets, the rest periods between work bouts or exercises, and the amount of resistance, number of reps, and velocity of movements. Okay, so if any of that's not clear to you, then chuck a question about it. But we might move on in a hot minute. While you as a parkour coach are probably never going to be designing and implementing a fully fleshed out, individualized, periodized training program for your students, for each of your students in a class, because that's a lot of work, this needs analysis is still a helpful checklist to go through to ensure you're not falling into the trap of just making conditioning hard for hard's sake. While we're not required to understand the ins and outs of sports science to be able to coach well, and I would say also that there are a lot of good, really good technique coaches in parkour and outside of parkour in organized sport who don't know this stuff from an academic standpoint. It's worthwhile to appreciate that you can be more fine-toothed in your approach, much more critical in your approach, and more exacting in your choices than perhaps you might have considered before, and you might normally think about this stuff with. Okay, so moving on, we have the aspects of fitness. Oh no, my slide's all wrong. Oh well. This is an inexhaustive list. things you can't see are agility, coordination, balance, stamina, speed, and accuracy. So I don't know, at some point in this little process that
sorry, I'll try and
that's gone wrong.
find it.
So sorry, the formatting's gone. The thing I want you to take away from that is that muscular endurance. Think about wall sit, muscular endurance. Hang on a second. Can everybody still hear me? Or are we dead?
I can
cool.
hear you.
Cheers. Yeah, sweet. So, muscular endurance, strength, gross strength, just force production, power, agility, and speed are separate aspects of fitness. Okay? So that's all good, Alicia. You don't necessarily have to see the slide right now because I've badly formatted it. So
I've made it worse. I'm sorry.
That's okay. We'll skip to the next one. So yeah, main takeaway is aerobic capacity, anaerobic capacity, muscular endurance, strength, power, flexibility, and agility. These are all different parts of fitness, and you need to understand there is a distinction between them. So for example, power is force over time, how quickly you can produce the force rather than the amount of force. And strength is just gross force production, how much force you can generate total. So depending on what you want, if you are interested in being stronger, you will train differently to if you are interested in being powerful. And that's all I'll say on that, because energy systems is hard. So before we go any further, the next bit's going to be a bit dense. So just take 2 to 3 minutes. Let's stand up, walk around, have a shakeout, make yourself a tea if you want. I've got, we'll come back at 6:24, and in the meantime, I'm going to sit here looking awkward. Okay.
I can do that with you if you like.
Yeah, no worries. So stand up, move around, do some stretches if you've been sat hunkered over your computer screen for a while. I'm stood up, which is nice. You can't see it because the camera's angled, but I'm standing. There are my feet. How's your week been, Kel?
I don't know what time is anymore, so.
Yeah.
This is good though. My brain's working again.
Yeah. Cheers.
Yeah, hey.
Year 12 knowledge pulling through. Yeah, if you will have heard all this stuff before, hopefully, or some of you might have. In which case, like, nicely done. Well done, you. I'm actually a bit warm. I'm gonna take this off. So we might get back into it. Is everybody ready? Is anybody on the toilet? And do you need me to wait? Ready. Good stuff, Ricky. Thank you. Alrighty. Well, we'll do this again once we've got the screen back up.
Alright.
Okay, so while we're here, actually, so I mentioned energy systems a little while ago, while talking about Fleck and Kramer's needs analysis, which if you learn nothing else during this, then that needs analysis is a pretty solid takeaway. But we're going to look at energy systems in a little more detail now. So this is year 12 stuff probably at the end of this. And it is an extremely truncated and simplified version of the metabolic engine that keeps us all ticking. So if anything is not clear here, then questions at me at the end. And if you want to read more into bioenergetics, then there's some recommended reading in the reference list. So for the sake of brevity and everyone's mental health, we won't be diving into the particulars of like the metabolic pathways and their enzymatic kind of reactions. But if you come out of this module completely lost and feeling like you need a compass, then chuck me a message or like put one in the Q&A and I'll send you on some resources. So the first thing that we want to synthesize, that we want to integrate into us, is that there are three fundamental ways in which your body produces energy for use: 2 anaerobic and 1 aerobic. Okay, you've heard of anaerobic training or aerobic fitness or aerobics, or heard people say, oh yeah, I've got a really fast metabolism, or my metabolism's a bit slow. This is metabolism. This is dense but worth it. So there are 2 anaerobic, ATP PCR, and the anaerobic glycolytic respiration pathway. And the second thing is there is the aerobic or oxidative system by which you access energy for use. Okay, the second thing is that these are not gears on a car. You do not shift between them. All 3 of them are all occurring all the time to a greater or lesser degree. The devil is in which system is predominant, which system is doing the most legwork. Okay, so the third thing to understand is that aerobic metabolism, oxidative pathway, is extraordinarily efficient but slow, and the other energy pathways available to us are not. So that becomes relevant in a second. So if we look at them individually, so on the next slide we have the ATP PCR system, which is the least efficient, runs out quickly, but does yield energy from our body's fuel stores really, really quickly and really, really easily. The material effect of that is that it allows for really high muscular effort, really good force output, but only for a really short space of time. So usually between 3 and 15 seconds. So this is what you would do if you're trying to lift the heaviest weight you can. If you're going for 1 rep max, this is the system you're training. Olympic sprinters also use this. You know, the sprint, if you're doing a sprint for more than 15 seconds, it's either, you know, a 200 or 400 meter, or you're pretty slow. But Olympic sprinters sometimes don't breathe during a 100-meter event because there's no point. They don't need to. If you've ever seen someone lift a heavy weight or pick up a couch, they'll often go, and that is obviously them not breathing. They're using the Valsalva maneuver, which doesn't allow them to breathe. So there's no point because it's not providing energy. However, obviously, the intensity that this system allows is not sustainable, and also the fuel source just runs out. So once that happens, you start to need to reduce the intensity or stop. The longest long distance champion of the world. All right, next one is anaerobic glycolytic. So much more efficient than the, and has a more complicated series of chemical reactions that have to occur before you actually have energy for the muscle to use. And therefore it doesn't give as high an energy yield per second. Okay, so lower muscular force output through glycolysis, but it can occur for longer. It also produces lactic acid, which your body needs to clear away. It has its own set of enzymes that allow for the clear away of lactic acid from your muscles and your bloodstream. However, at a certain point, your body stops being able to clear that away, at which point lactic acid can accumulate. It's called your lactate threshold, and if anybody has ever thrown up during exercise, then that is basically your blood lactate reaching a point, like your body starts flooding with lactic acid, your blood lactic acid content starts to rise. It rises to the point that your body thinks you're being poisoned, and it then vents your whatever's in your stomach, the contents of your stomach. Okay, so that is what is at play here, is your lactic acid threshold or your lactate threshold through anaerobic glycolytic respiration. This one lasts for about 2 and 5 minutes, after which, by necessity, the oxidative pathway has to predominate. Okay, so you can do this one. This is, you know, the end of a 1,500-meter race at the Olympics. You know, the last lap, people start to push pretty hard. They don't love it, but they do it. All good. So, aerobic respiration. On the next slide. All right, aerobic respiration or oxidative respiration. Very, very efficient. To the point of being almost like 10 to 30 times as efficient as anaerobic from memory, but does require a long series of metabolic reactions before you actually get any energy out of it. So doesn't yield as much force production as anaerobic sources, but can basically continue indefinitely. Importantly, most of it's so like efficient and so preferred by your body that most of the adaptive changes that happen when you exercise are an attempt to raise the capacity of your aerobic respiration pathway. So your breathing getting quicker and getting deeper, your heart rate increasing, your blood vessels dilating, the amount of blood being pumped by your heart, your cardiac output. All of this stuff is just trying to raise how much oxygen is available for use so that you don't burn out. So having an understanding of energy pathways is, sorry, next slide. I got ahead of myself. Yeah. So having an understanding of energy pathways, knowing they exist even, is good because it allows you to better guide your own training and also the training of others. So it allows you to pick exercises and ways to do exercises, not just what they are, but how to do them, that affect what you want them to. And this is why what energy system is stressed is part of that needs analysis that we talked about earlier. So it's a good thing to have under your belt. Even if you only understand it at a foundational level, it's a good thing. Okay, so let's look at some specific recommendations for exercise. So we have first resistance training. Boy, she's a bit squinty. So I'm not going to focus heaps on muscle hypertrophy because I don't think it's relevant. This is all from the American College of Sports Medicine. So it's not the be all and end all, but it's pretty good. This is also all just resistance training. So weights, calisthenics, body weight exercises, all of that. Doesn't include any skill training or any kind of cardiovascular or systemic training. This is just dumb muscle stuff, like no skill, no full body stuff, just my guns. Okay. And again, always a need to means to an end, never the end itself. So let's have a look. Strength development. If you want to get stronger, novices 60 to 70% of 1 rep max for about 1 to 3 sets at what we would traditionally call the hypertrophy range, or 8 to 12 reps. Okay. I don't really want to read the whole thing out to you, but I will, just in case anybody here has visual impairments. So intermediate strength training. Okay, 70 to 80% of your 1 rep max is where you want to be working for multiple sets. It's kind of arbitrary, as many as you feel like, depends on your goals, but for 6 to 12 reps at a moderate velocity, for ideally 3 to 4 times a week versus 2 to 3 times a week for a novice. If you are advanced, if you are an advanced strength athlete, well, then well done you, but also you want to be working at 80 to 100% of your 1 rep max for multiple sets at 1 to 12 reps. So because it's so much more intense, you want to do less of them. Your limit is 12, not your, that's your upper limit, and your lower limit has also dropped like a stone. Unintentionally slow to fast. Unintentionally slow means that it is hard enough that you are not modulating the exercise's speed. You can't lift it any quicker if you try. Okay, that's the velocity. And we want to be doing that 4 to 6 times a week. Okay, so that is strength development. That is gross force production irrespective of time. So if we go to the next slide, we'll have a look at development of muscular power. I'm actually going to get this up on my computer because my phone has a tiny, tiny, tiny screen and my eyes are. So development of muscular power. For a novice, you want to be working at 0 to 60% of your 1 rep max. So compare and contrast that with the 1 rep max percentage that is strength. Okay, so before we were working at 70%, now we are working at 0 to 60%. So there's a drop, and the reason why there's a drop, and this is for lower body training, sorry, the reason why there's a drop is because we don't want to be getting stronger, we want to get more powerful. In order to get more powerful, we need to be able to do it at speed. Okay, so for a novice, for someone who is unfamiliar with power training, we want 0 to 60% of your 1 rep max for your lower body, or for your upper body, 30 to 60% of your 1 rep max. For 1 to 3 sets, for 3 to 6 repetitions at a moderate velocity 2 or 3 times a week. Okay, so already we're seeing lower volume, okay, fewer sets, fewer reps than what might be preferable for a strength program. Okay, intermediate lifters or intermediate power trainees, let's say, 0 to 60% of your 1 rep max for your lower body, same intensity, okay, but fast. Same intensity, same number of reps, 3 to 4 times a week rather than 2 to 3, but quick, okay? And for advanced, there's a big spike up to 85 to 100% of your 1 rep max. This is, you know, Usain Bolt territory. This is Jesse Owens territory. 85 to 100% of your 1 rep max for 3 to 6 sets, 1 to 6 reps, various strategies of achieving overload in this, but again, fast velocity and 4 to 5 times a week. So working pretty frequently during the week. You spend a lot of time hungry. Okay, so increased local muscular endurance. For a novice, loading should be light, doesn't really matter, just fairly easy. 1 to 3 sets, 10 to 15 reps. This is if you wanted to get better at ballet, for example. If you were a ballet dancer and you wanted to get better at doing a calf rise or just staying in a, what's it called, a demi point, then you would use this kind of training. So 1 to 3 sets, 10 to 15 reps, slow to moderate, slow for moderate reps and moderate speed for high reps. So if you're wanting to get more endurance, but you only have a short amount of time, or you're only doing 10 reps, then you would do the reps very slowly. Whereas if you were doing a high number of reps, then it's okay if you do it a little bit quicker. And for that one, 2 to 3 times a week. For an intermediate endurance athlete, okay, again, light, because there's a lot of it. So frequency, intensity, time, type. Intensity, low, we can do more time. We can do a greater number of reps. Okay, light, 1 to 3 sets, 10 to 15 reps. Slow for moderate, moderate, high. Nothing's actually changed here, okay? Except for the frequency per week, which is 3 to 4 instead of 2 to 3. And advanced, 30 to 80% of your 1 rep max big spike again. Various strategies of doing that, but 10 to 25 reps or more per set. Okay, slow to moderate, slow for moderate reps, moderate speed for high reps. Okay, and 4 to 6 times a week. So this is what we see in ballet dancers. I'm using ballet dancers as the example because it's easy to visualize. Ballet dancers are in training between 4 and 6 days a week, every single week, 365 days a year, if they're in a company. And they do lots of stuff. So they need to not have calf tears and stuff. So that would be what they're doing. Okay. So let your brain sit for a bit. There's a lot of numbers just then. But if you have access to the lecture slides or the recording, then you can go back and have a look at this again. I can also drop a link to this image because it's not hard to find. Cool, done. That's enough time. Let's move on. So specific recommendations for aerobic and anaerobic power or capacity training. So commonly called cardio training. Okay, you can do this continuously, as in one big long block, or you can do it as interval training, i.e. in rests, sets and reps, for which you allocate rest periods. Okay, so that is, going for a jog versus doing hill sprints is what we're looking at there. Okay, there are a few kinds. So there's long, slow distance, tempo training. Now, tempo training can be an interval training or a continuous training. It is kind of up to what you want it to do. But most running athletes and most of the literature about aerobic capacity training is in the context of helping running athletes run quicker. Most tempo training is continuous. Interval training, there is interval training and there is high intensity interval training or HIIT training. And then also there is fartlek training, which is different to both of those. It's a bit of both. So if we look at these in turn, okay, let's look at first one, which I think, next slide, we got it. Yes, so long, slow distance training, or LSD, not the fun kind. It is slow. Slow means relative to a running athlete's pace during a race. That does not necessarily equate to slow. It can still be pretty quick. So generally around 70% of your VO2 max, which is not inconsiderable. Good for oxidative capacity of your muscles and helping you fully optimize your usage of fat as a fuel source, but doesn't help with power necessarily. And if you do too much of it, you may actually strip whoever you are training of force production that they may need later, especially if you're a running athlete later in a race. At the end of the race, you want to start pushing, but if you're always kind of just doing long, slow distance training, it may actually decrease your ability to do that. Okay, so next slide is tempo training. So tempo training or threshold training, as in lactate threshold, is designed to stress whoever it is training at their lactate threshold or at a sufficient intensity to improve energy production for both anaerobic and aerobic metabolism. It can be interval or continuous, but is often continuous training. So an example of this would be a cyclist doing a 30-minute ride at an uncomfortable speed. So this is, 85+% of running pace, not necessarily of VO2 max, but of running pace. And importantly, in people with similar VO2 max, people with similar maximal oxygen uptake capacity, the lactate threshold is what makes the difference between high performance and lesser performance. So if you have two athletes with exactly the same ability to intake oxygen, the one who can operate more comfortably at a higher level of that will always win. So if you want to get better at cardio, then there are two things you want to look at, not just one. Okay, so if we look at interval training on the next slide, then interval training is helpful because if you break work into bouts, you can do it for more. Okay, work bouts for interval training should probably go for 3 to 5 minutes and be pretty close to VO2 max. Okay, like 80 to 90%, I think. Recommended to use a 1-to-1 work-rest ratio, so 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. Don't use it on participants who don't have a firm base of aerobic endurance. Okay, that doesn't just apply to first timers. That might be, you know, people in parkour who haven't really trained aerobic endurance much. Don't go for runs often, that sort of thing, because it's pretty mean. It's pretty harsh. Also, people with, you know, if you know someone's an asthmatic, then you want to be careful about who you give this to. But as an example of a way to train this, someone who wants to do the APA level 2 physical qualification, but isn't real great at the 10-minute 2K run, might train that by doing 10 rounds of a 2-minute 500-meter run. So I have to finish 500 meters in 2 minutes, do that 10 times. Okay, that is an example of interval training, though you could argue that 2 minutes is a bit short. But yeah, that's a way to think about it. Okay, next is high intensity interval training. Okay, so the high intensity part of this is important. Most things that I've seen, so we've done Tabatas in classes in Adelaide, and generally what people do is they start off really going hard, and then the next one they really go hard, on the third one less hard, fourth one a little bit less hard, fifth one a little bit less, and on, you know, the 6th round they're really, really struggling, and they're basically, you know, barely trotting along and dying doing it. So if that is the case, then you are not achieving the intensity that you want. Okay, so high intensity interval training, you have to operate at a high intensity, otherwise you won't get the training effect. So in the Tabata protocol, which is a great study and a great study design, and it's well worth a read, people 10 seconds on, 20 seconds off for 4 minutes at 170% of your maximal oxygen uptake is the power output on a little static bike. Okay, that is a very, very high power output, and they had real difficulty holding on to people for the study because it just sucked to do. But also, if anybody failed to hold on to that 170% of VO2 max, if they started to drop back and they started to flag and their power output dropped, then you stop the test. You stop doing it, okay? Give them adequate rest, make them do it again, okay? So the main takeaway here is that if you are programming or saying you're programming high intensity interval training, you need to make sure that people are operating at a high intensity, not just doing it for the first round and then starting to drop off as they have no way of recovering. Okay, so can be short or long, you know, 45 seconds or less. Okay, the Tabata is a good example of that. It's only 10 seconds on, but it's hard. Or long, 2 to 4 minutes. Very, very good for training anaerobic glycolysis, your middle of the 3 energy pathways. Also needs specific planning of your rest periods. So if you're too short, you burn out quick, okay, which we've already talked about. Too long, and it's not enough to make a difference. So if someone is doing sprints, but they take 20 minutes in between their hill sprints, then they're not really stressing their energy systems in the way that they perhaps should be, okay? High intensity interval training should be above 90% of your VO2 max or more. Okay, so and that can go basically indefinitely, depending on how cruel you are. So the Tabata, as we've said, 170%. So you can go quite high. Let's look at fartlek. Okay, so fartlek is quite similar to what we do, or like the metabolic requirement of fartlek is quite similar to parkour. Fartlek is from the Swedish for speed play. So in essence, it is running at different running speeds for indeterminate or determinate amounts of time. So 70% of the VO2 max combined with either hills, running up a hill, or short bursts of fast running at 85 to 90% of VO2 max. So that is kind of similar to what parkour does in that if we are doing a trace or a line, especially a long trace or line, we are going at a fairly easy pace, and then suddenly there's bursts of energy that we are required to push through. So a jump or a climb up or a wall run or something like that, a vault, an underbar. Okay, so this one is pretty good. It's a bit freeform compared to the other ones. You can, like, people do specific, this is, you know, the team tempo fartlek program, and you do a specific amount of stuff, but there is also like a great deal of flexibility here, and depending on how far you take it. Indian file, which we've done in Adelaide, where one person is at the back, or everybody's running in a line, one person at the back sprints to the front, next person sprints to the front, next person sprints to the front. That's an example of fartlek. It's a very, very simplistic way of doing it, but it is an example of that. Okay. All right. So that's most of what I wanted to cover, but there's a couple of other stuff. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about miscellaneous kind of things. So other things that I haven't mentioned yet. So metabolic conditioning, very similar to HIIT training, but it is specifically to produce a large metabolic debt as a means of reducing people's body fat. We probably won't ever have to use this here, but I want you to know that it exists for the sake of completeness. Plyometric training, we haven't really covered this a whole lot because we basically do it. It's almost all of parkour is plyometric training to a greater or lesser degree. It is using the stretch reflex to facilitate motor recruitment, and using the connective tissue spring and its elasticity to return energy to generate explosive power, generally in jumping. Okay. For plyometric training, if you're doing heavy plyometric training, probably have a baseline of strength is a recommendation. You can combine it with resistance training in what is called complex training, which an example of which would be get people to do a fireman carry squat. You know, okay, grab a partner, do 8 squats. Okay, now jump up these stairs, but you don't get any rest in between doing box jumps and doing squats. So that one's, I don't know, maybe a bit mean depending on who your partner is, but it is an example of complex training. Plyometric training is also quite high impact. So it should be, you know, you should tread lightly around it when training people who are older, who are at risk of osteoarthritis or osteoporosis, and also heavier people. So over 100 kilos. So, you know, people like bodybuilders, people with high body fat percentage, that sort of thing. Those folks will need to have a bit more care and a bit more mindfulness than, yeah, just do the drop. It's fine. Yeah, cool, go. You know. So just be aware plyometric training is quite high impact, but it's also really helpful for us. RPE, or rate of perceived exertion. This is a way to think about how intensity works. So in a lot of the things we kind of have access to, the the intensity is modulated by percentage VO2 max. And you saw up north, further up in the lecture, it was percentage of 1 rep max or percentage of VO2 max, right? We don't really need to do that. And in some cases, like we don't have a gas analyzer or a, you know, any of the equipment that would be required to run a VO2 max test or monitor someone's VO2 max. And it's kind of inappropriate for us to like assume that we would do that. So just using a 1 to 10 scale of how difficult is this for you? Okay, this should be about 9 out of 10 for you because we're doing HIIT training and it should be hard. Is, you know, the official kind of position statement on using rate of perceived exertion as a way of modulating or monitoring intensity is that it's fine. It's okay. It's fine. It's not the best. It's not the worst. It's a little vulnerable to subjectivity and influence from music, from the presence of other people, from the location, in the clothes you're wearing. But it's fine. It's okay. It's fine. It's fine. So just use that. There are a couple of different RPE scales. There's the 1 to 10, which, you know, is quick and easy, and there's also the Borg RPE scale, which goes from 6 to 20, which I prefer. But obviously, if you don't have a little printout that says rate your exertion from 6 to 20, with 20 being very hard or maximal and 19 being almost maximal and working its way down, then you don't need to do that. Just be like, how hard is it out of 10? And people will be able generally to kind of pretty closely match what it actually is for their bodies, for their physiology. Side note, don't, like, if someone's not able to give you a response, then maybe it's a bit too hard, just as a thought. But yeah, that's the main thing. On the next slide, okay. Oh yeah. I forgot about this. So, in terms of specifics for parkour, obviously, like you'll notice, I haven't talked about any specific exercises that are really good for parkour. Mainly because depending on how you train it, it's kind of arbitrary. You can do parkour in a way that gives you enormous amounts of upper body strength, or you can do parkour in a way that makes you, you know, a T-Rex with like very small arms and very big, strong, powerful legs. Or you can kind of do it your own way, but some things are quite helpful, and the following things are kind of the things that I think are most helpful. So grip strength, particularly in hanging. If you can do a minute of hanging on your fingers on a bar, then that will be very helpful for you. Full depth squat, if you have adequate hip mobility to achieve a full depth squat, then you will be in a very good position. If you end up making a mistake on a jump and having to access range that you perhaps may not have trained. And also, I know Kelly is it is a bugbear of Kelly's that some people are like, yeah, training for parkour, I must be a holistic athlete, but also touching my toes is not at all relevant to my sport. Also, yeah, so I definitely think that hip mobility is very, very, very helpful for us. It's not necessarily necessary, and some people like mechanically won't be able to hit a full squat. But check anyway. Make sure that you at least do people the compliment of checking that they have hip mobility and that they can work on it, because it's really helpful. Ankle dorsiflexion range, as in doing that, pulling your toes back towards your face. I don't know if anybody saw that. All right. Pulling your toes up or the top of your foot up. Super helpful, mainly because it allows you to prevent ankle thing, which is a hyperextension injury of your ankle. What you do when you accidentally undershoot a jump. If you have really good ankle range, it will protect you. It'll have a protective effect on that. The other two, if you can hit 180 degrees, as in totally flat, easily through shoulder flexion, lifting your arm up in front of you until it is facing the sky, is quite helpful, I think, just because there's less stress and strain on your rotator cuff and the like tendons of your lat and stuff if you suddenly jolt onto your arms from a hang. And also, I would say a 90-degree wrist extension. So pulling your wrist back actively without forcing it, being able to hit 90 degrees through your wrist is super helpful. Just because if you fall and land on your hands and your wrists are really stiff, you're probably going to cause yourself a ligament injury. Okay, so those are kind of like benchmarks for, in my mind, what would constitute pretty good balance of basic things that people will have that will allow them to train parkour safely and more effectively. Okay, with regard to core conditioning, gymnastic strength training, all the gymnastic ab routines are pretty good for parkour. They have a good amount of carryover for us. Just because their goals are quite similar. So the goals of gymnastic core training isn't to like have a six-pack, it is to have the ability to transfer or resist force going from top to bottom. So doing a back tuck requires you to pull your hips up in a certain way, in a very similar way, in fact, to the requirement for a precision. And I see your question, Philip, and I will have a look at it. Stability, the last thing, yeah, this is a conceptual thing. The last thing I want you to have a look at is stability. Think about it as strength sufficient to resist motion. And that doesn't mean, you know, just being super strong means I'm super stable. It means having an adequate balance of strength in muscles supporting your joints to resist motion through whichever range you put your joint. Okay, so you can be very strong without being stable. You can be very stable without necessarily being very strong. Yoga practitioners do that a little bit. Very high level yoga practitioners, very, 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 very strong, not in a way that would allow them to lift lots of weight, but in a way that allows them to do lots of fairly difficult body weight positions for a long period of time. There's, what was it? There was one other thing that isn't on here, which I've forgotten, but kind of been important. So I think that's all. Let's change slides. Oh yeah, cool. So in summary, we now know that in order to maximize the effectiveness of our exercise prescription, not necessarily of our own training, we should perform a needs analysis. Okay. We now know that our prescription should be specific, directed, justified, supplementary, and the minimum effective dose. We now know the difference between working out and directional or directed conditioning. We now have a broad strokes understanding of the physiological systems behind metabolism and how they affect and are affected by exercise. We know the various aspects of fitness and the principles underpinning its development. And we now have looked at the specific recommendations for prescribing exercise, the table of which exercise modalities you should do. So if we check the next slide, then that is the reference list, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, cool. So here is where I got most of my information. There is more information in these than there is in my brain. So if you found this not helpful, then go checking out these books and the journal article at the end. All right, so that's it for me. Just maybe click one more time.